You did not stop giving because you ran out of love. You stopped because you finally noticed that being needed and being loved had become the same word in your mouth, and one of them was quietly starving the other. For most of your life, this confusion protected you. If someone needed you, you had a place. If they depended on you, the door would remain open. The heavier their need became, the more secure your belonging seemed, so you gave before anyone finished asking. You answered the message while your own day remained unfinished. You heard the smallest change in someone's voice and adjusted yourself before they had even named what they were feeling. You entered rooms already measuring what everyone else might require from you. This was not weakness. It was a kind of fluency, a language you learned so early that you no longer remembered learning it. You could sense tension before anyone spoke. You knew when to soften your voice, when to become useful, when to make yourself smaller so that someone else would not have to feel uncomfortable. People called this love. They called you kind, generous, selfless, the one they could always count on. You wore those words like proof. They seemed to confirm that the arrangement was working, that you were performing the one role that would keep you from becoming forgettable. But love was not something you received. It had become a service you performed. Then something changed. Someone needed you. And instead of warmth, you felt a small tightening in your chest. A familiar request arrived, but for the first time, your answer was not yes before thought. Part of you leaned back. You told yourself you were tired. You told yourself it was temporary. Perhaps you only needed sleep, space, or a few days without anyone asking anything from you. But the tiredness did not disappear after rest. That was the first sign that this was not exhaustion in the ordinary sense. Something older in you had begun to refuse. Something that had remained quiet beneath years of availability was no longer willing to disappear simply because another person had a need. And the moment you stop proving your love through sacrifice, some people will say that you have changed, not because your love has disappeared, but because their access to it has. This is what you are beginning to see. When being needed stops feeling like love, it does not mean your capacity to love has died. It means you can finally feel the difference between the two. And once that difference becomes conscious, you cannot return to the old innocence. For years, being needed and being loved were braided together so tightly that you could not separate them. To be needed was to matter. To be useful was to be allowed to stay. To anticipate another person's pain was to protect yourself from the possibility that they might withdraw. The arrangement was rarely spoken aloud. No one had to say, "You may belong here only if you remain useful." The message was taught through smaller moments. Warmth arrived when you helped. Approval appeared when you required nothing. The atmosphere changed when you expressed a need of your own. You learned from repetition. You learned that your tenderness made people comfortable, while your hunger made them uncertain. You learned that your competence was welcomed, while your vulnerability created inconvenience, so you kept offering what was rewarded and quietly buried what was not, through a Jungian lens. This is one of the quieter ways a persona forms. Not through a mask you consciously decide to wear, but through a role rewarded so early and so consistently that it grows over the self like bark over a wound. Eventually, you can no longer tell where the protection ends and you begin. The giver was not a false costume. It was a real capacity that became a requirement. Your tenderness was real. Your ability to notice other people was real. The care you offered was not an illusion. But somewhere along the way, noticing stopped being a choice and became the price of admission. A gift that must continually be given to preserve your place is no longer entirely a gift. It becomes a form of psychological labor. You notice who is upset before they tell you. You prepare yourself for the conversation before it begins. You arrange your words so carefully that the other person never has to encounter the full weight of your truth. You carry the emotional consequences they are unwilling to carry themselves. After enough repetition, this begins to feel natural. You stop seeing how much energy it requires because the labor has been folded into your identity. You do not say, "I am working to keep everyone emotionally stable." You say, "This is simply who I am," but the body remembers what the persona makes invisible. Someone says they need to talk, and your shoulders rise toward your ears. Your stomach drops slightly. A heaviness enters your chest before you even know what they are about to say. The reaction arrives before the explanation, before you have consciously decided anything at all. For years, you would have overridden this reaction immediately. The dread felt like selfishness, and selfishness felt like danger. You would have forced warmth into your voice, ignored the contraction in your body, and become available once again. Now the contraction remains. It refuses to be explained away. It does not disappear when you remind yourself that the other person is struggling. It does not soften when you repeat that you should be more compassionate. That small dread is information. It is the body recognizing a familiar arrangement before the conscious mind is ready to name it. It remembers how these conversations end. It knows how quickly listening becomes carrying, how easily sympathy becomes responsibility, and how often another person's crisis requires you to abandon your own life. Notice who knows how to find you when something has gone wrong. Notice who reaches for you in a crisis but rarely asks what your life feels like when no one needs saving. Notice who knows every entrance into your compassion but almost none of the rooms inside you. This does not necessarily mean they are cruel. Some of them may genuinely care for you, but they learn to relate to the version of you that was always available, and you helped teach them that this version had no cost. You concealed the cost so well that even you stopped seeing it. Consider what happens when you imagine saying no, not a cruel no, not abandonment or punishment, just a simple, ordinary boundary. Notice how quickly guilt arrives to fill the space. It does not wait for the other person to become disappointed. It does not require anyone to accuse you. The guilt appears before anything has actually happened. That speed matters. It tells you that the guilt is not only about this person or this particular request. It belongs to an older arrangement in which your needs were the thing that made rooms unsafe. Long before this moment, you learned that the surest way to remain welcome was to have no requirements of your own. Your availability became a form of protection. If you could understand everyone, perhaps no one would misunderstand you. If you could soothe them before their emotions became overwhelming, perhaps they would never turn those emotions against you. If you could become indispensable, perhaps you would never be left. So you built a life in which you were needed almost everywhere and known almost nowhere. For a long time, you did not notice the difference. Being needed produced so much contact, movement, and evidence that you were essential. The messages kept arriving. People told you how much they relied on you. Your absence created visible problems. From the outside, it looked exactly like love, but being needed and being known are not the same. When someone needs you, they may be reaching for what you do. When someone knows you, they are willing to encounter who you are, including the parts that cannot rescue, reassure, or provide an immediate answer. The person who needs your function may be disappointed by your limits. The person who wants to know you becomes curious about them. This is the gap you are beginning to feel. People may know your warmth without knowing what exhausts you. They may know your strength without knowing what it costs to maintain it. They may know how safe they feel in your presence while remaining unaware of how unsafe you feel expressing your own needs. They are touching the function while the person underneath it remains out of reach. And that person can remain hidden for years because usefulness creates the appearance of intimacy. People reveal themselves to you. They tell you their fears, their regrets, their wounds, and their secrets. You may know more about their inner lives than anyone else does. But disclosure is not always mutual intimacy. Sometimes another person's vulnerability simply gives you more emotional material to carry. They feel understood because you have entered their inner world. Yet they may never become curious enough to enter yours. You leave the conversation knowing everything they feel, while they leave knowing almost nothing about you. This is the hidden conflict now becoming conscious. Being needed versus being known. One of them kept you safe. The other is what you actually wanted. But being known required a risk you could not take. It required allowing someone to see a self that was not endlessly capable, emotionally fluent, or easy to depend upon. It required admitting that you had needs that could not be transformed into usefulness. For a long time, you solved this conflict by telling yourself that being needed and being known were the same. If I am needed enough, surely I am loved. If I give enough, surely someone will eventually see me. If I remain available long enough, perhaps one day they will turn toward me with the same attention I have given them. You did not necessarily say these things aloud. You lived them. Every act of overgiving carried a quiet hope inside it, a hope you might have felt ashamed to name. That hope was not manipulation. It was the survival logic of a self that had learned to reach for love through the only door that appeared to be open. You were never only trying to help. Beneath the genuine care was a quieter longing that someone would finally see the person doing the giving. This is why the giving never felt complete. You could solve the problem, answer the call, remember the important date, absorb the disappointment, and carry the burden. They might thank you sincerely. They might tell you they did not know what they would do without you. For a moment, you felt essential, but essential is not the same as cherished. The gratitude faded. Another need appeared. The relationship returned to its familiar shape, and the person underneath your usefulness remained waiting. You were knocking on the wall of usefulness, hoping someone would eventually walk around it and find you. When being needed stops feeling like love, that old hope has begun to collapse. Some part of you no longer believes that giving more will finally make you visible. The secret promise beneath the sacrifice has stopped feeling believable, and when that promise disappears, the giving loses its hidden engine. What remains is the labor without the hope that once made the labor feel meaningful. You begin to notice the emotional cost of conversations you once entered automatically. You feel the resentment you previously translated into compassion. You recognize how often your generosity required you to abandon something unfinished inside yourself. That is why a request that once produced warmth may now create contraction. The warmth was never only kindness, it was also expectation, faith, and a silent bargain beneath the surface. If I keep showing up for you, perhaps one day you will show up for me. If I become necessary enough, perhaps I will become impossible to abandon. The bargain was rarely conscious, but the disappointment was real. Now that the bargain has stopped paying, the body can feel the transaction more clearly. It knows when care is moving freely and when care is being used to purchase security. It knows when you are giving from genuine desire and when you are giving because the imagined consequences of refusing feel unbearable. This recognition does not make you cold. It does not mean your compassion was false. Your tenderness was real, but your tenderness was carrying something it was never meant to carry. It was being asked to secure your belonging, prevent rejection, manage other people's reactions, and silence your own hunger. No amount of compassion can survive forever under that weight. Through depth psychology, what is returning here is not cruelty. It is a buried preference. Somewhere beneath all that availability was a self with desires, limits, rhythms, and refusals of its own. That self did not disappear. It entered the unconscious because there was no safe place for it in the life you had built. Now it is returning in forms you may not immediately recognize. It returns as relief when plans are cancelled. It returns as quiet resentment when someone assumes you will handle everything as you always have. It returns as fatigue before a familiar conversation has even begun. It may appear as irritation when another person says, "I need you," even though those words once made you feel valuable. You may judge yourself for this reaction. You may wonder what happened to the generous person you used to be. But perhaps the generous person has not disappeared. Perhaps the abandoned person underneath the generosity has finally begun to speak. None of this means you have stopped caring about the people in your life. It means you have started, faintly, to include yourself among the people who matter. After a lifetime of leaving yourself off the list, even this small inclusion can feel like betrayal. The moment you consider your own energy, you fear becoming selfish. The moment you hesitate, you fear becoming unreliable. The moment you set a boundary, you fear becoming the kind of person you were taught never to be, because you were supposed to be the one who did not need. That was the entire arrangement. You understood everyone, you absorbed everything, you asked for almost nothing. You became the stable one, the forgiving one, the person who could always see the wound beneath someone else's behavior. The role gave you a place, but it was a place built around your absence. There was room for your usefulness, but no room for your hunger. There was room for your strength, but no permission for your limit. There was room for the comfort you provided, but very little curiosity about the person providing it. Now the hunger is here, and it will not leave. It does not yet announce itself clearly because you were never taught the language of your own need. It arrives instead as reluctance, fatigue, and the unfamiliar relief of not immediately saying yes. Being needed used to sound like love. Now it sounds like an arrangement whose cost you can finally hear. And the more clearly you hear that cost, the harder it becomes to return to the person you were. You can still give, you can still care, you can still offer warmth, but something in you now wants the giving to be chosen rather than extracted, mutual rather than assumed, and received as a gift rather than treated as your permanent function. This is where the real conflict begins, because the people who genuinely love you may need time to meet the self emerging beneath your usefulness. But the people who only loved the access you provided may experience your healing as deprivation. They may say you have changed. They may call your limits selfish. They may remind you of everything you used to do for them. And soon, an even more painful question will emerge. If you stop giving people the version of you they depend upon, who will remain close enough to discover who you actually are? You have to understand why this arrangement survived for so long. It did not survive because you were weak, foolish, or unaware. It survived because it worked. Their need gave you certainty, and your giving protected you from a question you were not yet ready to ask. It was not only that they needed you, their need protected you. As long as someone depended upon what you provided, you never had to discover whether they would choose you when you had nothing to offer. Their dependence gave you a position that ordinary affection never seemed able to guarantee. It gave you something you had learned to believe you could not receive in any other way. What it gave you first was certainty. Love had always felt unpredictable. It could change without warning. It could become distant, distracted, or conditional. It could look away at the exact moment you needed it to remain present. But being needed felt steady. If you made yourself indispensable, people could not easily leave without losing something important. Your usefulness turned your presence into infrastructure, and people do not casually abandon the infrastructure upon which their lives depend. That was the unconscious logic of the arrangement. If someone simply cared for you, their feelings might change, but if they relied upon you, their staying seemed connected to something more dependable than feeling. You had made yourself difficult to lose. You did not think of this as a strategy. There was no deliberate plan. You were not calculating how to make people dependent upon you. The process happened beneath conscious awareness. You noticed what made people move toward you. You noticed what made their faces soften, what brought praise, and what created distance. Your psyche learned the pattern long before you had words for it. When you helped, you were welcomed. When you required nothing, the atmosphere remained calm. When you solved a problem, restored peace, or carried what someone else could not carry, your place felt secure. So usefulness became the language through which you asked not to be abandoned. Through a Jungian lens, this is where the persona becomes more than a social face. It becomes an entire method of psychological survival. The giver was not merely how you appeared to others. It became the identity through which you secured nearly every bond you had. A persona that has taken responsibility for securing love does not surrender easily. To loosen, it does not feel like changing a habit. It feels like releasing the only rope holding your relationships together. Even when the role exhausts you, part of your psyche remains convinced that without it, everything will fall. That is why simple advice about setting boundaries often fails to reach the deepest part of the problem. A boundary may look like one sentence from the outside, but inside you it can feel like a threat to your entire structure of belonging. Saying no is never only saying no. It can feel like asking, "Will you still want me if I do not give you what you expected? Will you remain warm when I become inconvenient? Is there anything connecting us beneath the function I perform?" Those are not small questions. They touch the oldest uncertainty inside the arrangement. Watch how the pattern spread. It may have begun in one relationship, perhaps with a parent whose approval felt like weather you had to monitor. You learned to read the atmosphere before entering the room. You sensed tension, fatigue, disappointment, and anger before anyone explained what was happening. You adjusted yourself accordingly. You became easier when someone else was overwhelmed. You became quiet when your feelings might create more tension. You became helpful when usefulness brought the room back into balance. Eventually, this adaptation became portable. Once usefulness had proven that it could secure connection, you carried it everywhere. It followed you into friendships, romantic relationships, workplaces, and families of your own. It installed itself in every room before your conscious mind even understood that a choice was being made. At work, you became the person who stayed late, covered the absence, remembered what everyone else forgot, and quietly repaired what others left unfinished. People admired your reliability. Your competence became one of the safest identities available to you. But you did not do this only for recognition or advancement. A role with no needs of its own felt safer than a person who might want too much. Competence allowed you to remain visible without becoming vulnerable. You could be praised for showing up while keeping the deeper self hidden. In friendship, you became the listener. You were the steady person others called when their lives cracked open. You remembered every detail of their struggles, relationships, disappointments, and fears. Almost no one knew the same things about you. You may have told yourself that you were simply private. Perhaps you believed you did not enjoy discussing your problems. But beneath that preference was often an older conclusion you had reached without words. Your inner life was not for offering, it was for managing. You would process your fear alone so no one had to carry it. You would contain your sadness until it became quiet enough not to disturb anyone. You would solve your own problems before revealing that a problem had ever existed. You would be the one who carried. That arrangement followed you everywhere because it protected something real. It protected you from the terror of becoming too much. Somewhere along the way, you learned that expressing a need plainly could make people withdraw. Your sadness could exhaust them. Your anger could make a room cold. Your disappointment could be interpreted as accusation. So you tried to remove the danger at its source. You became someone with very little for others to push against. You shaped yourself around what they required and learned to present your own needs only after they had been softened, justified, reduced, or nearly solved. In return, you received a version of belonging. It was not the belonging you truly wanted, but it was a form you could predict. People kept you close because you were steady, attentive, and useful. Useful resembled loved closely enough that you could live inside the resemblance for years without examining the difference. The resemblance was especially convincing because the gratitude was often genuine. People did appreciate you. They may have admired your generosity and trusted your presence. They may have sincerely believed that they loved the person you were, but the person they knew was the person you consistently showed them, without meaning to. You taught those around you to experience your giving as something permanent. Because you rarely revealed its cost, they gradually stopped imagining that someone underneath it might one day need relief. Every time you said, "It is fine," when it was not fine, you made the burden disappear from their view. Every time you answered, "I can handle it," you reinforced the image of someone who required very little. Every time you concealed exhaustion behind warmth, you protected them from having to become curious about your limits. This was not deception in the ordinary sense. You were protecting the relationship in the only way you knew. But the protection came at a cost. The arrangement did not only hide your deeper self from other people, over time, it convinced them that there might be nothing more to find. They came to know the function so completely that the person beneath it became almost theoretical. This is the quiet tragedy of a role performed too well. When the mask never slips, no one realizes that there is a face waiting beneath it. You wanted to be discovered, but you became so smoothly capable that discovery appeared unnecessary. Why would anyone search for needs you had trained yourself never to reveal? They saw strength because strength was what you offered. They saw calm because you waited until you were alone to fall apart. They saw endless compassion because you hid every moment in which compassion had begun to cost you too much. You wanted someone to look more deeply, yet you feared what would happen if they did. This contradiction kept the persona intact. You longed to be seen, but being seen required exposing the needs you believed could make you unwanted. So you continued presenting the part of yourself most likely to be welcomed, while privately grieving that no one seemed to know the rest. Through unconscious repetition, the pattern began arranging your relationships to confirm itself. Again and again, you found yourself close to people who needed a great deal. This was not necessarily a conscious preference, and it did not mean you wanted to be mistreated. Their need was familiar, and familiarity can feel like recognition even when it is painful. Their need gave you a role. The role gave you certainty, and certainty spared you from the dangerous business of discovering whether you could be wanted simply as a person. You may have called this compassion. You may have believed you were simply someone who naturally found struggling people. Your compassion was real. But look again gently. The struggling person also offered you something. They offered you a function that could not easily be questioned. They gave you a place at the table that did not require you to reveal your own hunger. Their crisis organized the relationship around something you already knew how to do. As long as they were collapsing, you could remain strong. As long as they required understanding, you did not have to ask whether they were capable of understanding you. As long as they were leaning on you, you could avoid discovering whether they would choose to stand beside you. This is the reversal hidden beneath the entire pattern. Their need did not only consume you, it also protected you. The giving became a shield against the question you could not bear to ask. If I stopped being useful to you, would you still want me here? You rarely ask this directly because you may already have suspected the answer. Suspecting was painful but survivable. Knowing might have required you to see certain relationships differently. So you kept the shield raised. You anticipated what they needed. You intervened before a consequence could reach them. You made sure there was always another reason for your presence to remain necessary. The more useful you became, the less likely the question was to appear. But the question did not disappear. It moved into the body. Notice the constant low readiness that followed you through the years. Notice how you scanned each environment for what might be required. Notice the tension that remained in your jaw, shoulders, and stomach even during moments that should have felt peaceful. Rest was not always restful because rest meant being temporarily unneeded, and being unneeded meant being exposed. Without a task, there was no function securing your place. Without someone to help, you had to sit with the possibility that your presence alone might have to be enough. That possibility should have felt freeing. Instead, it often produced a formless unease. You learned to feel most secure when your usefulness was fully engaged. Put more painfully, you sometimes felt safest when you were being used well. The moments in which you carried the greatest burden could also be the moments when your place felt most certain. The exhaustion hurt, but the burden confirmed that you mattered. Someone required something only you seemed able to provide. Meanwhile, the moments when nothing was required could leave you strangely restless. You searched for another task, checked whether someone needed help, or returned to problems that were not truly yours to solve. You may have called this productivity, loyalty, or concern, but sometimes it was fear of the silence that appeared when usefulness stopped. That silence was where the unlived parts of you waited. It was where your own preferences might have surfaced if given enough time. It was where grief, anger, desire, and disappointment lived after years of being postponed. It was where the self you had protected everyone else from could finally begin to speak. So you filled the silence quickly. Another task, another message, another crisis, another person whose life required more immediate attention than your own. The activity kept you exhausted, but it also prevented you from meeting the parts of yourself that exhaustion had kept underground. This is the unlived life the arrangement required. It was not always a dramatic sacrifice. More often, it was made of 1,000 small abandonments. The preference you never formed because someone else had already decided. The desire you did not follow because another person needed you first. It was the weekend you gave away, the rest you postponed, and the truth you softened until it no longer resembled what you felt. It was the version of you that might have wanted something plainly and for itself, delayed so continuously that you began to wonder whether it had ever existed. But it did exist. In Jungian terms, what is excluded from conscious identity does not simply disappear. It enters the shadow. It remains active beneath the persona and begins seeking indirect ways to return. Your needs did not vanish because you refused to acknowledge them. Your anger did not dissolve because anger was incompatible with the identity of the giver. Your unlived desires did not stop exerting pressure because other people's needs appeared more urgent. They went underground, and what goes underground gathers force. At first, the buried self may appear as ordinary fatigue, then as reluctance, then as resentment that seems to arrive without permission. You begin to feel cold in situations where warmth once appeared automatically. You may interpret this as a moral failure. You may wonder whether you have become less loving, but the reluctance is not necessarily the death of compassion. It may be the return of choice. For years, you gave before choice could enter the room. Your answer was already yes before you checked what the request would cost. The persona responded so quickly that the deeper self had no opportunity to speak. Now the deeper self is interrupting the response. It is creating a pause. Inside that pause, you can finally feel two different impulses. One part of you still wants to care. Another part is asking whether caring must always require self-abandonment. That question changes everything. The self that waited beneath the giving has grown too large to remain hidden. It is beginning to refuse on your behalf before you have granted it conscious permission. It is creating exhaustion where obedience once felt effortless. This is not because the self wants to punish anyone. It is because it has run out of willingness to wait for a decision you were never going to make. It knows that if giving continues in its old form, there may eventually be nothing left beneath the function. This is why the arrangement can no longer continue as it did. Not because you have confidently chosen to end it, not because you have mastered boundaries or stopped feeling guilty. The arrangement is ending because it has begun to consume the very thing it was created to protect. It kept you connected by keeping you useful, but the usefulness is now consuming the self that wanted connection in the first place. The shield has begun to press against the heart it was guarding. Soon, you will have to lower it, even if only slightly, and when you do, you will discover which relationships were connected to your heart and which were connected only to what your heart kept providing. The tiredness comes first, and sleep cannot repair it. Rest can restore a tired body, but it cannot restore a self you keep abandoning. You wake already spent because the exhaustion does not belong to any single task. It is the accumulated weight of every moment in which you disappeared inside what you did for someone else. You have tried resting. You have taken the quiet weekend, the empty evening, and the cancelled plan you told yourself you needed. But when the next request arrived, the depletion returned immediately, almost as if the rest had never happened. That is because the exhaustion was never only about doing too much. It came from repeatedly disappearing inside what you did for other people. The body rested, but the arrangement remained untouched. And beneath the tiredness, if you allow yourself to feel deeply enough, there is something you were taught never to name. Resentment, not loud resentment, not dramatic rage, something quieter and more unsettling. A low, steady current directed toward the very people you have spent your life helping, and toward the arrangement that made helping the only reliable way you knew to belong. You feel it when someone assumes you will handle everything without asking. You hear it in the certainty of their voice, in the way a request is no longer phrased as a request because years of experience have taught them that your answer is already yes. Something in you has begun to resist that certainty. The resentment may appear in ordinary moments. A message arrives, and you wait before opening it because you already know what will be asked. Someone begins telling you about another crisis, and instead of compassion, you feel your body becoming heavy. They may not have done anything different. The arrangement may be exactly as it has always been, but you are no longer the same person receiving it. This frightens you because resentment does not fit the identity you have protected. You are the giver, the understanding one, the person who does not keep score. You have built your moral identity around the belief that real love gives freely and asks for nothing in return. But the resentment has been keeping score in a ledger you refuse to read. It recorded every yes spoken over an internal no. It remembered every evening you surrendered, every feeling you swallowed, and every limit you crossed, because disappointing someone felt more dangerous than disappointing yourself. Now the ledger is open, the numbers are large, and some of them are attached to people you genuinely love. This is where you must become honest in a way the old persona would never allow. The resentment is not only evidence that others may have taken too much, it also reveals how often you continued giving after something inside you had already withdrawn its consent. You spent energy the deeper self had not agreed to spend. You made promises on behalf of a person you had not consulted. You offered time, attention, patience, and emotional labor without asking whether the person inside you could afford what was being given. Now that person is no longer willing to remain silent. Part of the anger may be directed toward those who assumed too much, demanded too much, or benefited from your inability to refuse. That anger may be justified, but another part is directed inward. It is directed toward every moment when you felt your limit and crossed it anyway. Every time you recognized the cost but smiled as if there were none. Every time you protected another person from your truth because you feared what their reaction might reveal. This does not mean you should blame yourself for learning a survival pattern. What began as adaptation was often active before conscious choice could enter the room. You were not freely deciding between equal possibilities. You were responding through a nervous system that had learned to associate usefulness with safety. But what once protected you gradually became an arrangement in which you continued participating, not because you wanted to suffer, not because your love was false. You continued because the giving spared you from something that once felt even more dangerous than exhaustion. It spared you from standing before another person with empty hands and discovering whether you were wanted anyway. There is the deeper fear. If you were not solving, soothing, carrying, remembering, forgiving, or anticipating, what would remain between you and them if there were no crisis requiring your presence? Would they still reach toward you? Overgiving prevented the question from becoming unavoidable. It became an unconscious way of controlling the uncertainty of connection, not controlling another person, but controlling the conditions under which closeness could continue. As long as you set the price and paid it yourself, you did not have to wait helplessly to discover whether someone would show up for you. You made yourself valuable before they had the opportunity to decide what your value was. You offered the answer before they could ask the question. You never had to say, "Please choose me." You could say, "Let me help you." You never had to reveal how much you wanted love. You could become the person who appeared to need nothing while giving everything. This is why receiving often felt more dangerous than giving. To receive, you would first have to admit that you needed something. Then you would have to allow another person to decide whether they were willing and able to meet that need. You would have to wait. You would have to surrender control over the outcome. You would have to risk gratitude, disappointment, dependence, and the possibility that what you offered so freely might not be returned. Giving protected you from that vulnerability. You could pour yourself outward and remain emotionally defended. You could create intimacy through another person's disclosure without exposing the parts of yourself that most needed tenderness. From the outside, you appeared open. Inside, the deepest doors remained locked. The giving was not only love, it was also a fortress, and the drawbridge moved in only one direction. Care could leave you endlessly, but very little was permitted to enter, because letting something in meant admitting there was a hunger, and that hunger was the one thing the entire arrangement had been built to hide. Even from you, through a depth psychology lens, this is the shadow inside the virtue. The kindness was real, but it carried another function beneath its visible one. Care could reduce uncertainty. Selflessness could prevent you from being examined too closely. Strength could protect the vulnerable self from ever having to appear. The trait everyone praised was doing quiet psychological work that almost no one could see, including you. This does not corrupt the kindness, it makes the kindness human. The shadow does not mean that every act of care secretly contained manipulation. It means that no human virtue exists without unconscious material gathering around it. What we refuse to acknowledge does not disappear. It begins operating inside the identity we are most determined to protect. The person who must always be generous may hide forbidden anger. The person who must always be strong may hide unbearable need. The person who understands everyone may be protecting themselves from asking whether anyone is willing to understand them. This is the knowledge beginning to surface now, and alongside the tiredness, it can bring shame. Part of you senses that the collapse of the giver is not only the loss of something beautiful, it is also the exposure of motives you would rather not have known. Your love sometimes contained a silent bargain. Your selflessness sometimes protected you from the vulnerability of receiving. Your generosity sometimes allowed you to approach intimacy without placing your own heart fully inside it. These recognitions may feel brutal. The old persona will try to turn them into an accusation. It will say that your compassion was never real, that you have been secretly selfish, or that you caused every unequal relationship in your life. Do not follow it there. Self-accusation would only be the old pattern wearing a different face. Once again, you would make yourself responsible for everything. Once again, you would carry the entire burden so that the complexity of what happened would disappear. The shadow is not returning to condemn you. It is returning because it is true. Admitting that fear existed inside your love does not erase the love. Admitting that you participated in the arrangement does not excuse the people who exploited it. Admitting that giving helped you feel safe does not mean you deserve to be taken for granted. It means you can finally see the whole pattern rather than the version that kept your identity intact. The tenderness was never fake. That matters. You did love the people you gave to. You cared about their pain. You wanted to make their lives gentler, and many of the things you offered came from something sincere. But the love became entangled with fear. Fear used love as protection. Love gave fear a beautiful identity. For years, you could not separate them because doing so would have required feeling the fear directly. Now the entanglement is coming apart. It hurts the way any old fusion hurts when it begins to separate. You are discovering which acts came from genuine desire and which came from terror of losing your place. Sometimes both were present at once. That is why the truth feels complicated. You cannot dismiss everything you gave as false, but you can no longer call all of it freely chosen. Then comes grief. You grieve the years spent becoming necessary to people who may never have known you. You grieve the self that waited underground while you exhausted yourself on the surface. You grieve the desires that were postponed before they had language. You grieve the preferences you never developed because someone else's need always arrived first. There may be ordinary things inside this grief. The journey you never took, the work you never attempted, the relationship you remained inside long after your body had begun asking to leave. There may be years when you cannot remember what you wanted because your attention was always turned toward what everyone else required. Some of that life cannot be relived, and this must be grieved. But the self that carried those unlived desires has not disappeared. Its return is the reason the old arrangement is collapsing now. If there were nothing left of you beneath the role, there would be no resentment, there would be no exhaustion, no reluctance, and no refusal. The pain is evidence that something remains. Something inside you still knows that another way of living is possible, even if you cannot yet imagine its shape. You are also grieving the belief that held the entire arrangement together, the belief that if you gave enough, someone would finally reach you. You carried that hope for years like a coin hidden inside a closed hand. Every sacrifice seemed to add weight to it. Every act of care whispered that perhaps this time someone would turn around and see the person behind the giving. Now the hand has opened. The coin is not there. No amount of giving could purchase the love you wanted because love cannot be purchased through disappearance. The door you kept knocking upon did not open from that side. This is not merely disappointment in other people. It is the collapse of a private religion, a belief that organized your choices, relationships, and identity is losing its authority. That collapse can feel like emptiness. The old meaning of your goodness is dissolving. You do not yet know what kindness looks like when it is no longer used to secure belonging. You do not yet know how to care without abandoning yourself. The body registers this uncertainty in its own language. The chest that once leaned forward toward every need now remains still. The hands that reached before thought begin to hesitate. The immediate warmth is replaced by a pause you do not yet know how to interpret. The pause may feel like coldness. It frightens you because you cannot tell whether something loving has died or whether the body is drawing the first honest boundary it has ever been allowed to draw. But look more closely. The compassion may still be present. What has disappeared is the automatic movement. The body is no longer translating another person's need into your immediate responsibility. The jaw that once prepared an apology before you had done anything wrong stays closed. The shoulders that rose toward every request remain lowered. The message arrives, and you do not answer immediately. Someone becomes disappointed, and you do not rush to erase their discomfort. Another person falls silent, and for the first time, you allow the silence to belong to them. These moments can appear insignificant from the outside. Inside you, they are revolutionary. The old persona interprets every pause as danger. It tells you that love must move quickly, goodness must explain itself, and compassion must prevent other people from experiencing consequences. But the deeper self is learning something the persona never understood. A pose is not abandonment. A boundary is not cruelty. Another person's discomfort is not always a command. This is the interval you cannot skip. It may be the most difficult part of the entire transformation because the old identity no longer works, and no stable new identity has arrived to replace it. You can no longer give in the way you once did, but you do not yet know how to remain connected from any other position. You are between arrangements. The old arrangement offered certainty at the cost of your disappearance. The new one asks you to remain present without knowing who will stay. There is no immediate comfort in this. You cannot fully return to the automatic yes, because the illusion that powered it has failed. You have seen the fear beneath the sacrifice and the silent bargain inside endless availability. Once seen, the mechanism cannot become entirely unconscious again. Even if you try to resume the old role, the body interrupts you, the resentment returns, the fatigue deepens. What once felt natural now feels like self-betrayal happening in real time. But you cannot yet move confidently forward either. Forward would require something you were never taught. It would require being present without earning your place. It would require allowing silence to exist without filling it with usefulness. It would require letting someone encounter your disappointment without immediately comforting them for causing it. Most frighteningly, it would require risking being wanted as a self you have kept hidden for so long that you are not certain who that self is. You may ask what remains when the giver stops giving. For a while, the answer may feel like nothing. That emptiness is not proof that there is no self beneath the role. It is the space in which the buried self must learn to become conscious. At first, it may speak only through refusal. Not that conversation, not tonight, not again, not at this cost. The no arrives before the new yes has found its language. This is why the transformation can look like coldness from the outside. Other people see the withdrawal of what you once provided, but they cannot yet see the self emerging beneath it. You cannot fully see that self either. You are tired, grieving, and suspended between two identities. You are no longer able to become who everyone needs, but you do not yet know how to become someone who can need without shame. Then the people around you begin to notice. They feel the delay in your answers. They sense that sympathy no longer guarantees intervention. They discover that telling you about a problem does not automatically make the problem yours. They begin reaching for the old version of you. Some will reach gently because they genuinely miss you. Others will reach with confusion, pressure, guilt, or accusation because what they miss is not your presence, it is the certainty of your availability. You will feel their reaching in the oldest part of you. You will feel the familiar command to move, explain, repair, and restore the arrangement before anyone becomes disappointed. But for the first time in your life, you remain still, and in that stillness, every relationship begins to reveal what it was truly connected to. They notice before you explain anything. The people who knew you as the giver feel the change in the space around you. They hear it in the pause before your answer, in the message you do not respond to immediately, and in the yes that sometimes no longer comes. Some respond by pushing, testing, or waiting for you to return to the role they recognize. Others become quiet, uncertain how to relate to a person whose limits they had never been required to see. You have changed, they tell you. Sometimes the words are spoken with confusion, sometimes they sound like an accusation. Sometimes they are offered as a correction, a summons back to the arrangement upon which they had come to rely. You used to be easier to talk to. You used to understand. You used to always be there. The verbs are all in the past tense, and the past tense is the point. They are comparing the person standing before them with the version of you who rarely paused long enough to consult themselves. Some say it more sharply. You have become selfish, distant, cold. This is not like you. The last sentence lands hardest because it names something true, though not in the way they intend. It is not like the version of you they knew. That version was organized around a function, and the function is no longer automatic. You are no longer responding before choice can enter the room. You are no longer translating every sign of another person's discomfort into an obligation to move. To them, this may look like the disappearance of love. To you, it feels like the arrival of consent. The guilt comes quickly, as it always has. For a moment, it almost works. It almost pulls you back into motion, back into explaining, fixing, and proving that you are still good by dissolving yourself once more into another person's need. You feel the familiar urge to reassure them that nothing has changed. You want to offer something large enough to erase their disappointment and restore the warmth between you. The old machinery is still intact. It still turns. It simply no longer turns you because you can see what the guilt is attempting to protect. Their disappointment may be real, but it is not automatically an emergency you must erase. Their difficulty may deserve compassion, but it does not instantly become your responsibility. The guilt is protecting the old arrangement in which every sign of someone else's discomfort became a command for your immediate movement. It wants the old world restored because the old world is the only one it knows how to survive inside. In that world, you always knew what to do. You gave, you apologized, you found the right words, you closed the distance with pieces of yourself. Now you are learning that another person's unhappiness does not always mean you have done something wrong. Sometimes it means that two separate people have reached the edge of what one of them is willing to give. The old you experienced that edge as a rupture. The emerging self is beginning to understand it as a boundary. This is where you must hold something difficult without escaping into either blame or self-sacrifice. When people say they miss the old you, not all of them are being cruel. Some are genuinely grieving a relationship that has changed. They miss the comfort, warmth, and stability your giving brought into their lives. Their grief is real, but their response reveals what the relationship had learned to depend upon. Some people loved you, but became accustomed to a version of you who required very little. They may feel confused at first, yet remain capable of adjusting when your limits become visible. Others were connected primarily to the access you provided. When that access changes, they intensify the pressure because usefulness, rather than mutual intimacy, had been holding the bond together. And some understood more than they admitted. They noticed the cost, benefited from your difficulty, saying no, and now use guilt because guilt once restored their access quickly. You do not need to decide immediately which category every person belongs to. You only need to observe what they do after you stop abandoning yourself for them. Do they become curious about your experience? Can they hear no without punishing you? Can they remain connected when you are no longer solving the problem? Can they tolerate a relationship in which your needs occupy space alongside their own? A boundary does not create the character of a relationship. It reveals the amount of mutuality the relationship was already capable of holding. That revelation may hurt. For years, you believed that the intensity of someone's need proved the depth of the bond. Now you are discovering that the clearest evidence may appear when you do not give them what they want. Some people respond to your limit by trying to understand it. Others respond by trying to remove it. The difference tells you more than years of gratitude ever could. This does not mean you must condemn everyone who struggles with your change. You taught many people, without intending to, that your giving was permanent because you concealed its cost. They may genuinely have believed that endless availability was simply your nature. They knew what you consistently showed them, but that does not mean you alone created the arrangement. Relationships are built through the participation of more than one person. Some people accepted your claim that everything was fine because they trusted you. Others accepted it because looking more closely would have required something from them. You can understand how the pattern formed without excusing every way it was used. You can recognize your participation without accepting responsibility for another person's entitlement. And understanding why someone is hurt does not mean returning to the role that was hurting you. This is the maturity the moment requires. It is quieter and more difficult than either rebellion or surrender. You can see why someone is disappointed and still refuse to fix their disappointment. You can feel compassion for their loss without offering yourself as the cure. You can love them and allow them to be unhappy with you. That is the thing you were never taught to do. Giving was easy because giving restored certainty. What you never learned was how to let another person want more from you than you were willing to provide. You never learned how to remain present while someone misunderstood you. You did not know how to survive the silence after saying no without filling it with apology, explanation, or compensation. The old persona read disappointment as danger. A changed expression meant connection was at risk. A delayed response meant you had failed. Another person's withdrawal could send you searching for what you needed to offer in order to bring them back. Now you feel the same signals, but you no longer obey them automatically. You notice the tightening in your chest. You hear the voice insisting that you should explain yourself more clearly. You feel the impulse to offer one final sacrifice so everyone can return to being comfortable. And then you wait, not because you have become indifferent, not because their feelings no longer matter. You wait because their feelings are no longer the only feelings permitted to matter. The emerging self can hold their disappointment and your limit at the same time. This is not coldness. It is a sober tenderness that refuses to rescue either person from reality. They are allowed to want more. You are allowed not to provide it. They are allowed to interpret your limit through their own history. You are allowed to stop organizing your life around controlling that interpretation. This may be the first time you understand that love and disappointment can exist together. Someone can care about you and still dislike your boundary. You can care about them and still refuse their request. A relationship does not have to become comfortable immediately in order to remain real. Then something strange begins to happen in the stillness. Some relationships thin out. The messages become less frequent when you stop solving the problem. Certain people become less interested when your attention is no longer endlessly available. The bond begins receding because it had developed almost nothing beyond the function you performed. The self beneath the role was always there, but the relationship had never learned how to reach it. This is a loss, and it is also a clarification. While it is happening, you may not be able to tell the two apart. You may miss people whose absence confirms something painful about their presence. You may want them back even after recognizing that they were attached primarily to what you provided. Awareness does not remove attachment. You can understand why a relationship was unequal and still grieve its ending. You can know that returning would require self-abandonment and still long for the familiarity of the old arrangement. The psyche does not release what was familiar simply because the conscious mind has identified its cost. So you grieve, but this time you do not use giving to prevent the grief. You let the loss show you what the relationship was capable of becoming and what it was never willing to become. A few other relationships do not recede. When your automatic giving stops, these people do not merely demand its return. They become curious. They notice that your warmth had a cost. They begin asking questions they had never thought to ask. They make room for answers that are not convenient. They ask how you actually are, and they remain present long enough to hear something other than fine. This is terrifying in a different way. It is the very thing you always wanted and never learned how to risk. To be approached as a person rather than summoned as a function. You may not trust it. When someone turns their attention toward you sincerely, the old reflex still rises. You want to deflect, minimize, make a joke, or redirect the conversation toward their life. You know how to be the listener. Being listened to feels exposed. You know how to provide care. Receiving care makes the hidden hunger visible. Part of you may even distrust the person who offers it. You wonder what they want in return. You search their kindness for the demand that must be hidden inside it. That suspicion does not disappear simply because you have met someone safer. The pattern softens slowly, one interrupted reflex at a time. Someone asks how you are, and instead of saying fine, you offer one honest sentence. Someone offers help, and instead of refusing immediately, you let them complete the gesture. Someone remains after you disappoint them, and you resist the urge to purchase their continued presence through overgiving. These moments may appear small, but each one teaches the psyche that connection can survive without your disappearance. The relief is real, but it does not arrive cleanly. It comes tangled with grief for the years when you could not live this way. It comes with sorrow for relationships your change has disrupted, and fear that your needs will eventually become too much. You may wonder whether you have become the very person you spent your life trying not to be. Someone difficult, someone with limits, someone who cannot always be counted upon, someone who might be left. The fear does not mean the old arrangement was right. It means the old arrangement was protecting a wound that has not yet learned a different form of safety. You have not resolved everything. That is the honest place you have reached. You still love people. You still feel the pull to give. Sometimes you give and the giving feels clear, warm, and freely chosen. Other times, you give and feel the old fear moving beneath it. You cannot always distinguish compassion from compulsion immediately. You are learning a language late. You speak it with an accent. You misunderstand yourself. You say yes when you wanted to say no. You refuse something and later wonder whether you were protecting a boundary or protecting yourself from intimacy. None of this means you have failed. Consciousness does not make every choice simple. It makes the conflict visible enough that a real choice can finally exist. In Jungian terms, this is not the destruction of the giver, it is the separation of a genuine capacity from the persona that once controlled it. You do not lose your kindness, you recover the right to decide when, where, and from what part of yourself it will be offered. The giver becomes one capacity among many rather than the identity that organizes your entire existence. Care becomes something the self can choose, not something fear must perform. This is part of individuation. You stop asking one socially rewarded identity to carry the whole of your personality. You allow strength and need, tenderness and anger, generosity and limit to belong to the same human being. The goal is not to become less loving, it is to become whole enough that love no longer requires your disappearance. Something has ended, and it will not fully restart. The automatic yes is gone. The reflex that spent you before you could consult yourself has been interrupted. It will not return with the same innocence because you have seen what it was doing. You know the difference between the warmth that moves freely and the warmth summoned by fear. You know how the body feels when giving is chosen, and how it feels when giving is used to prevent abandonment. You may still enter the old pattern, but you can no longer live inside it without recognizing the cost. The giver has not been destroyed, it has simply lost the power to move you without your consent. For most of your life, being needed drowned out a quieter question. Am I wanted when I have nothing to offer? Now that the giving has become still, the question is finally audible. You do not need to answer it immediately. You are learning how to live inside the uncertainty without filling it with service. You allow the question to remain open. You allow some people to leave, some to struggle, and some to remain close enough to meet the person beneath the role. You are needed less now. You are known a little more. The exchange is harder than you expected because being known asks something that usefulness never required. It asks you to be present without earning your place. It asks you to reveal preferences that may disappoint someone. It asks you to allow another person to offer care without proving that you deserve it first. It asks you to believe that your presence may possess value before it becomes useful. You are only beginning to believe this, but beginning is enough. Being needed is no longer your proof that you are loved. Usefulness is no longer the price you pay to remain, and the love that remains after your usefulness ends is the first love you no longer have to earn.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychoanalysis. My name is John, and I created this channel to explore the unconscious patterns that shape our emotions, relationships, and identity. Our videos are original, modern interpretations inspired by the psychological ideas of Carl Jung. They are not authentic recordings, direct quotation, or exact representations of Jung's words. Artificial intelligence may assist with script development, narration, visuals, subtitles, and editing. However, every video is reviewed, refined, and creatively directed before publication. This channel is created for education, reflection, and storytelling, not therapy, diagnosis, or medical advice. Thank you for being here, and welcome to the psychoanalysis, where the unconscious becomes visible.